Well, welcome to the last Chapter 6 installment. Today we'll be talking about the evaluation of mutually exclusive alternatives with unequal lives, and we cannot make the repeatability assumption as such. I'm going to modify that a little bit in a minute. But we will be looking at a particular study period and try to understand what cotermination is and how to handle that situation. Just to recap, mutually exclusive alternatives. We'll be selecting one from among a set of multiple alternatives. Number two, for this problem, we have unequal lives. So each of the alternatives may have a different life than the other alternatives. Okay, sorry I got interrupted there a little bit. I'm back. Okay, so we know the scoop. This is the, if you look at Module 4 worksheet on your module spreadsheet, you'll see the same problem that we looked at in Module 3. That is, we have four alternatives, A, B, C, and D. We have unequal lives, 5, 6, 10, and 4 years, respectively. Sorry, gone and back. And we are not going to assume repeatability. For this problem, we have a study period, and generally, when you're evaluating business activities, you do have a time horizon or a study period. And for most investments, whether that be in plant and equipment, technology, whatever, those sorts of investments may have a defined life. And that's really what we're talking about here, a given study period or defined life. So again, step one and step two that you look at here are for the different alternatives. We need to make sure that we're using the correct interest rate. We use 10% or 12% here. And again, I did the IRR. We've got you can see what the internal rates of return are there. And again, beat a dead horse, but we don't want to ever compare the rates of return among the alternatives. That's an inappropriate sort of comparison to do. Step 3 says we will coterminate at 5 years. So we have a study period of 5 years, and each one of these alternatives will stop at the 5-year point. And if you look in the step 4 definition, I say here that we don't want to eliminate alternative B because the market value will change. Alternative B has a life of 6 years, but we're going to chop it off after 5 years. And in order to do that, we need to determine a new market value, ending market value for alternative B. Since that ending market value may change, I want us to stop for a moment. I'm gonna go back and alter this, but at least for the moment, let's not eliminate alternative B based on the rate of return that we found at this point. Alternative A has a 5-year life. It's a 5-year study period, so we don't touch alternative A. We can look at it just as it is. What we do know about alternative A at this point is that it's a good alternative because at the 5-year point, we see that the rate of return is above the MAR, and that's good. For alternative D, which has a 4-year life, what do we do with that? Well, we handle things a little bit differently, whether it be an investment alternative or a cost alternative. Let me first say, for cost alternatives, which these are not, but if we're confronted with cost alternatives, these provide some level of service for a number of years. So it's not just an investment where we'll get money back after a while. This provides some some benefit, not monetary benefit, but some function, provide some function for a period of time. And if our study period is longer than the life of an alternative, for a cost alternative, we somehow need to fill in that gap between the life of the alternative and the study period with an equivalent service. We might lease an asset for that period of time, however long that is. We might repeat that asset. So we might, at a small level, assume repeatability one time that would allow us to, okay, we're going to repeat, we're going to buy another version of that asset, and just like repeatability, but we will repeat it and then we'll chop that off, like I'm going to talk about alternative C here in just a moment. In an investment problem, which is what we have here, these are investment alternatives. What do? Well, investment alternatives give us a return. So what we will assume for alternative D, since its life is less than the study period, is that we will assume that after alternative D is complete, after 4 years, that the funds will earn at the MAR for that last year. So during the 5th year, up until the end of year 5, we assume that the funds that have returned for alternative D will be reinvested at the MAR, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a moment. Okay, so alternatives B and C, what do we do with them? Their lives are greater than the study period. Well, first note that in all cases, the initial costs remain the same for these alternatives. The annual cost, the regular income cost, whatever, all that remains the same for all these alternatives. It's just a matter of determining what the market value is going to be at the end, and to include that in our analysis. And then we can use, once we have the same number of years for all, then we can use any of the rules, present worth, future worth, annual worth, incremental analysis. We can use all of those because we've converted the unequal lived alternatives to equal lives with a study period. What do we do with alternatives B and C? Well, we simply need a new market value. So let's just look at the cash flows, for example, for alternative C. The initial investment, $100,000, remains the same. The net annual revenues, $22,675, remains the same. The market value is what's different, because we have the $25,000 listed there is a market value at the end of 10 years. However, we will complete our study period at the end of 5 years, so we need a 5-year market value. What will be the market value at the end of 5 years? So our goal here is, if you look at the table, is to replace that $25,000 with a different cash flow, a different value. Our useful life will change from 10 years to 5 years, and the rate of return, who knows what the rate of return would be, but those then would represent the cash flows we would use to analyze that alternative. Same thing for alternative B, as we'll learn in a moment. Now, 2 things we could do, excuse me, with alternatives B and C. Number 1, we could get the experts, if you will, to estimate what the market value will be. One could argue that perhaps that's how we got the current market values at the end of 6 years and the end of 10 years. That's one alternative, and it's possible that I could, on a test, on a quiz, I could tell you what that is. I could give you that number, which would be great. Then you just plug it in and go. But another method to use is something called the imputed market value technique. Now, you may think this technique is a little bit squirrely. There are some things that really don't necessarily make some sense. But as I've said previously, let's just follow the rules and the procedure, and we'll use the number that comes up. This is legitimate. It has been well documented and derived in the literature. It does typically give a market value that seems a little bit higher than perhaps it should be, but regardless, let's stick with it and see how we're doing. So let's look at step 5. To find the imputed market values for alternatives B and C, you can do this actually, we could build one big function that would do all this, but I'm going to do this in 2 steps. First of all, you need to find the capital recovery amount for these 2 alternatives. And you can see there in cells C25 and C26, I've found the capital recovery amount for each of those 2 alternatives. And just briefly again, what does that mean? Well, it's the PMT, or the annual amount, that represents the initial value spread out over the years of life, and the final market value spread back over the years of life. And for each of these, it's, the capital recovery factor is for the true life of the project. So you'll see for alternative B, we have it refers to cell D8, which is 6 years. And when we go on and calculate it for alternative C, it refers that the number of years is reference cell is E8, which is 10 years. Recovery factors for the respective years of life, current years of life for these investment assets. Now, here's the way this process works. Imputed market value. What I'm going to do next is to take, let's say, for example, let's look at alternative C. Study period of 5 years, life of 10 years. So in years 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, we have this capital recovery factor that we essentially never touch, we never get to. So the imputed market value technique instructs us to take that capital recovery amount for those remaining years, years 6 through 10, and bring all of that back to the present being end of year 5. So we first find the capital recovery amount, and that's an annual amount. Then we're going to take the remaining years, for the years beyond the study period, and we're going to take those annual cash flows and squish them back up and find the present worth, the economically equivalent amount of those future cash flows at the end of the study period. That's one thing we will do as part of the imputed market value. The other thing we will do is we will take the current market value at the end of 10 years, in the case of alternative C, and we will then bring that back. It's a future amount at the end of 10 years. We will bring that back to the end of year 5. So we'll do a P given F, a present value of that single amount 5 years into the future. So we bring that back. Now typically that market value part that I just described doesn't add a whole lot to our imputed market value, but we do it anyway. You might argue that it seems like we're double counting that. Argue away, it does seem like we're doing that, but just follow the rules and do it. So we'll take the present value of the future capital recovery amounts, and we'll add to that the present value of the market value out there, add those together, and that gives us the imputed market value at the end of the study period. So if we look in cells C29 and C30, you see respectively the market value, the new market value, imputed market value for alternatives B and C. You can see I've used the PV function. You can see that for the number of years, I've given the current expected life minus the study period. So for alternative B, we only have 1 year of this going on, right, for alternative B. And for alternative C, we have 5 years, 6 through 10. We have 5 years going on. And then for the cash flows, I have referenced, for the annual amount, I have referenced the capital recovery amounts. Notice I put the negative sign in the function because I want to retain a positive. We want these to be positive numbers. It's a positive market value coming back. And for the future amount, I have referenced, for alternative B, I've referenced cell D7, which is the current market value at the end of 6 years. And for alternative C, I referenced the current market value at the end of 10 years, and I'm bringing that back. So the values in cell C29 and C30 then are the imputed market values for alternatives B and C. In step 6, I've presented a revised cash flow table, and this revised table has the only change here you'll note is for alternative B and C, I've changed the market value, and I've changed the useful life to 5 years. Alternative D I have not touched, so more on that here in just a moment. Now, I've calculated the internal rate of return for these now, and notice that for alternative B, it's still below the MAR. And we went through all this trouble, and it's still unattractive. As it turns out, and I wanted to go through these steps, but as it turns out, this will be the case, generally will be the case, when you use the imputed market value technique. And there is, let's just leave it at that. So in truth, in reality, if we're going to be using imputed market values, when we got that initial IRR less than the MAR for alternative B, we could have wiped it out and not considered it any longer. And you're welcome to do that on a quiz if that should pop up. Okay, now let's. So hopefully that table, revised table there in step 6 is clear. Now in step 7, we do our present worth analysis. We could have done annual worth, future worth, incremental. The easy one is present worth for me, and that's what I did. And you can see the alternatives there, A, B, C, and D. Again, I stuck with alternative B. It's a negative present worth. What a surprise. There are our alternatives, A, B, C, and D. And there we have it. So the winner would be alternative C, which, again, please note, does not have the highest rate of return, but it does have the largest present worth, and so we would select alternative C using this method. One thing to note is with alternative D, the beauty of the assumption we make about reinvesting the funds at the MAR is that we're finding the present worth at the MAR. So all we have to do is find the present worth of that investment at the MAR, and that present worth, even though it's over only 4 years and not over 5 years, if we take invest our money strictly at the MAR and we're earning just the MAR, the present worth of that would be 0. If we're looking at an investment that returns exactly the MAR and we find the present worth at the MAR, we would get that present worth to be 0. So that extra year adds year 4, the 5th year between years 4 and 5, really adds nothing to the present worth if it's earning the MAR. So we can just find the present worth over the 4 years for alternative D. It's $11,931. That is exactly what the present worth would be over the 5 years, making the assumption, again, that we would reinvest the funds at the end of the 4 years at the MAR. And we can make that assumption. So there you have it. That's imputed market value. And remember, it sounds fancy, but all we're doing is we are finding a new market value for a shortened life of an asset. And that really concludes all we're going to cover in Chapter 6. Next week, when I return, Chapter 7 is the order of the day. We completely switch gears for Chapter 7. We're going to step back away. We're going to do some accounting. It may be a little bit rough, but we're going to do some accounting to begin and set the groundwork for depreciation, income taxes, and then we jump back into the present worth, future worth of cash flows area. So I hope you learned something from this, and I hope you have a nice weekend. And if you see this before, and I hope you do, before the quiz, good fortune to you on the quiz tomorrow. Tomorrow for me anyway, doing this. Hope you have a good afternoon.